For 20 years, every time Bob Dylan walked through the backstage doors of Madison Square Garden, he was greeted by the same man with the same respectful nod and the same three words. "Good evening, sir." But what Dylan didn't know was that those three words were hiding the most beautiful secret in rock and roll history. It was March 15th, 1975, when Frank Morrison first saw Bob Dylan walk into Madison Square Garden. Frank had just started his job as head of backstage security, and he was nervous about his first major concert. Dylan was at the peak of his Rolling Thunder Revue tour, and the garden was buzzing with the kind of electric energy that only came with true legends. But here's what nobody expected, including Dylan himself. When Dylan approached the security checkpoint, Frank looked directly at him and said simply, "Good evening, sir. Right this way, please." No fanfare, no wide-eyed recognition, no requests for autographs, just professional courtesy. Dylan was taken aback. After years of being mobbed by fans and security guards alike, this man treated him like a regular person. Frank Morrison was 45 years old, a Vietnam veteran who had taken the security job to support his family after struggling to find work. He was a quiet man, thoughtful, and he believed in treating everyone with dignity regardless of who they were. But there was something Frank wasn't telling anyone. He knew exactly who Bob Dylan was. Frank had been a Dylan fan since 1963, when he first heard "Blowin' in the Wind" on a crackling radio in a Saigon barracks. Dylan's music had gotten him through the war, through nightmares, through the difficult transition back to civilian life. Those songs had quite literally saved his life. But that March evening in 1975, as Dylan walked past him into the garden, Frank made a decision that would define their relationship for the next 20 years. He decided to give Bob Dylan something no one else could: the gift of anonymity. You see, Frank had been watching Dylan closely as he entered the venue. The singer's shoulders were tense, his jaw was tight, and his eyes had that look Frank recognized from his military days, the look of a man carrying too much weight. Dylan seemed exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally, like he was drowning in his own fame. So Frank, this working-class security guard from Queens, made a choice that would change both their lives. He would pretend not to recognize the most recognizable voice of a generation. Over the following months, Dylan began to notice Frank's consistent behavior. While other security guards would either fawn over him or treat him with suspicious reverence, Frank simply did his job. Professional, courteous, but never crossing that line into personal space. "Good evening, sir." Those became the three words Dylan started looking forward to more than he'd ever imagined. But what Dylan didn't realize was that Frank was fighting an internal battle every single time they interacted. Here was his hero, the man whose music had carried him through his darkest hours, walking past him like a regular person. And Frank was pretending not to care. It was torture. Beautiful, necessary torture. By 1978, Dylan's visits to Madison Square Garden had become more frequent, and something remarkable was happening. Dylan would sometimes linger at Frank's security station, making small talk about the weather, the crowd, how the city was changing. These weren't conversations between a rock star and a fan. They were conversations between two men who had both seen too much of the world and appreciated quiet moments. Frank never asked for autographs, never mentioned songs, never brought up concerts. He talked to Dylan about normal things: how the Rangers were playing, construction on 7th Avenue, the best place to get coffee before a show. And Dylan started to relax. But here's where the story gets incredible. One evening, in 1982, Dylan arrived at the garden looking particularly worn down. His marriage to Sarah had ended. The critics were brutal about his Christian period, and he was questioning everything about his career and his life. As he approached Frank's station, instead of the usual, "Good evening, sir," Frank looked at Dylan with genuine concern and said, "You all right tonight, mister?" He paused, as if he didn't know the name. "You look like you could use some coffee." Dylan stopped walking. For 7 years, this man had treated him with respect without ever using his name, without ever acknowledging his fame. But tonight, there was something in Frank's voice. Care. Real human care. "You know what?" Dylan said, sitting down on a folding chair next to Frank's desk. "I could use some coffee, and someone to talk to who doesn't want anything from me." They sat there for 30 minutes before the show, drinking terrible venue coffee and talking about everything except music. Dylan told Frank about growing up in Minnesota, about feeling lost in his own life. Frank talked about Vietnam, about raising kids on a security guard's salary, about the simple satisfaction of doing your job well. For 30 minutes, Bob Dylan wasn't Bob Dylan. He was just a tired man talking to another tired man about the weight of living. And Frank continued to pretend he didn't know who he was talking to. This became their routine. Every time Dylan played the garden, they would share coffee and conversation. Frank would ask about Dylan's travels, his thoughts on the city, his opinions on everything from baseball to politics. Never once did he mention music, concerts, or fame. But Dylan was beginning to suspect something. You see, Frank was too good at this. He was too comfortable, too natural. Most people, even when trying to be cool around celebrities, slip up. They make references, they ask leading questions, they show some sign of recognition. Frank never did. He was either the most naturally diplomatic person on earth, or he was the best actor Dylan had ever met. The breakthrough came in 1987, during Dylan's tour with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Dylan arrived at the garden early and found Frank setting up his station for the evening. "Frank," Dylan said, using his name for the first time in 12 years. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, sir." "Do you listen to music?" Frank paused for just a moment too long. "Sure, everyone listens to music." "What kind?" Another pause. "Oh, you know, bit of everything. Classic rock, some folk music." Dylan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Any particular artists?" Frank looked directly at him, and for the first time in 12 years, Dylan saw something flicker in the older man's eyes. Recognition? Guilt? Love? "I listen to music that means something," Frank said carefully. "Music that tells the truth about life. Music that helps people get through hard times." They stared at each other for a moment that felt like an hour. Dylan knew, but he didn't say anything. Neither did Frank. The game continued. For 8 more years, they played this beautiful charade. Frank pretended not to know who Dylan was, and Dylan pretended not to know that Frank was pretending. But their conversations deepened, became more personal, more meaningful. Frank told Dylan about his son who was struggling with addiction. Dylan shared his fears about getting older, about whether his music still mattered. They talked about loss, about purpose, about the difference between success and satisfaction. Through it all, Frank continued to greet Dylan with those same 3 words. "Good evening, sir." But everything changed on October 16th, 1995. Dylan arrived at Madison Square Garden for what would be his final show of the tour, and Frank wasn't at his usual station. Instead, there was a young security guard who immediately recognized Dylan and started gushing about being a huge fan. Dylan felt a strange panic. Where's Frank? Frank Morrison? He's retiring after tonight. 20 years on the job. There's a small party for him in the break room after the show. Dylan couldn't concentrate during his performance that night. All he could think about was Frank, retiring after 20 years, probably going home to a small apartment in Queens, never having acknowledged the secret they'd shared. After the concert, Dylan did something unprecedented. Instead of leaving immediately, as he always did, he went looking for Frank's retirement party. He found it in a small employee break room, about 15 security guards and maintenance workers sharing cake and coffee, celebrating Frank's 2 decades of service. When Dylan walked in, the room went silent. Here was Bob Dylan, one of the most famous people on earth, standing in their break room. But Frank, sitting at the head of a folding table with a paper plate of grocery store cake, just looked up and said what he'd said thousands of times before. Good evening, sir." The room was electric with confusion and anticipation. Everyone was looking back and forth between Dylan and Frank, trying to understand what was happening. Dylan walked over to Frank and, for the first time in 20 years, sat down directly across from him at eye level. "Frank," Dylan said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Frank nodded. "You've always known who I am, haven't you?" The room held its breath. Frank looked around at his colleagues, then back at Dylan. After 20 years of pretending, the moment of truth had arrived. "Yes, Mr. Dylan," Frank said simply. "I've known since the first night you walked through that door. You could have heard a pin drop." "Then why?" Dylan asked. "Why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you ask for autographs or mention my songs or treat me like everyone else does?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Because," Frank said finally, "you looked like a man who was drowning in people wanting things from him. You looked like you needed at least one place where you could just be a person, not a legend." Dylan's eyes filled with tears. "And because," Frank continued, "your music saved my life in Vietnam. The least I could do was give you 3 words of peace every time you came to work." The room was completely silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the garden being cleaned up after the show. Dylan reached across the table and took Frank's hand. "You gave me 20 years of feeling normal," Dylan said. "Do you have any idea what a gift that was?" Frank smiled. "You gave me 20 years of the best job in the world. Getting to see you walk through that door, knowing you were okay, knowing you were still making music. That was the highlight of every workday for 2 decades. What happened next stunned everyone in the room. Bob Dylan started to sing. Quietly, almost in a whisper, he sang the opening lines to "Blowin' in the Wind." But this wasn't the version anyone knew. This was slower, more personal, like a conversation between old friends. Frank closed his eyes and listened, and when Dylan finished the first verse, Frank joined in for the chorus. His voice was rough, untrained, but it was full of 20 years of gratitude and respect. The other security guards and maintenance workers gradually joined in, creating the most unlikely choir in Madison Square Garden history. Janitors and security guards, and one of the greatest musicians who ever lived, singing together in a break room over grocery store cake. When the song ended, Dylan looked at Frank with complete sincerity. "What are you going to do in retirement?" "Spend time with my grandchildren. Maybe do some volunteer work. I don't need much." Dylan thought for a moment. "Frank, I want to ask you something."